This is going to be a little bit of a different show, isn't it, Chris?
Why?
Because we're not alone. There's someone else in the room.
Do I need to call an adult?
Are you not an adult?
Have we met?
No, that's fair. Hello, alleged human, and welcome to the Chaos Lever podcast. My name is Ned, and I'm definitely not a robot. I'm a real human person who needs to monitor their dihydrogen oxide intake and output to make sure it stays within normal tolerances. Just like you. I definitely do not consume the blood of humans to stabilize my quasi-organic internals. That would be vampirically ridiculous. With me is Chris, who's also here. Hi, Chris.
I mean, when you say things are ridiculous, it always sounds like you don't mean ridiculous.
Maybe. As I alluded to, we also have a guest joining us, which is very exciting. Our guest is Doug Madory. Is that how you say your last name, Doug?
Yep.
Oh, man, I got it on the first try. That's awesome. Doug is the director of internet analysis at Kentik, and he has definitely forgotten more than I've ever learned about BGP, routing, and the internet. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. A few weeks ago, we talked about BGP a bit, and we established that, well, if you haven't listened to it, probably go and listen to it, especially if you're not familiar with BGP at all. But it's a protocol that was initially designed when the internet was a small, friendly place full of nerds who just wanted to get things connected. Everyone kind of knew everyone, and asking others not to be assholes about it just kind of worked at the time. And that's true of so much of the early internet. SMTP, HTTP, FTP, and other protocols didn't have security even as an afterthought. Essentially, everything was sent in plain text, and trust was just assumed. And that was the world of the mid-1990s. 30 years later, the internet is a very different place, and somehow BGP is largely the same. So let's talk about that. Doug, so BGP was originally based on building relationships between neighbors, exchanging network layer reachability information, and it all had this assumption of trust. When did that start to become a problem?
So, I mean, it still inherently is the same as far as that goes. I started in this space in the year 2009, so I've been doing this for about 15 years. And in that time, there's been any number of cases of either like deliberate routing hijacks in order to disrupt or misdirect traffic, or more frequently, mistakes. There's a lot of people will fat finger on a router, causing a large internet outage, and a couple of the problems that we deal with in the BGP world.
Okay, so there's two different, I guess, things that people have to be worried about that you brought out there. One is like malicious activity trying to mess with neighbors and redirect traffic in some way. And others just like, man, it was Friday. I was trying to get out. I hit a command and I've blown up half the internet.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty frequent. I would say it was a little too frequent when I was getting started in this space. And I would say we've made a lot of progress on that category of building some belts and suspenders to try to improve that side of the problem. What we in the space call the other side is the determined adversary. So someone who is an attacker who's very knowledgeable of what security mechanisms have been deployed, how they work, what are their weaknesses. And so the determined adversary is kind of an unsolved problem thus far on BGP.
Okay. So you mentioned that there's some things have been put into place to help with the fat fingering problem. What are some of those controls or ways that we've tried to fix that half of things?
Yeah, sure. And when I talk to audiences about this topic, I like to say that BGP security or this whole topic, it's not a one thing. This is a constellation of problems that we have a variety of different things that can go wrong. It's going to require a few different solutions. And there's also a spectrum of difficulty. One end are kind of the bonehead errors that hopefully we could come up with some automated ways to prevent them from causing disruptions, on up to the determined adversary I mentioned a minute ago. But yeah, we can mention some of the things that people have networks are using. A lot of it has to do with how do you filter the routes that you accept. So in your previous episode, I'm sure you kind of went through this process of this route by rumor. An AS will accept routes from an adjacent AS to try to learn how to reach other parts of the internet. So you'd like to have some sort of quality control over the routes that you accept. And in that genre of mechanisms, you have the very coarse thing of like what we call max pref setting. So if I normally get 10 routes from you, I shouldn't tomorrow suddenly start getting a million. There's probably a problem. And if it does, it should maybe kill the session or take some sort of an action. So that was one of a number of like really simple mechanisms that I don't want to take credit for it, but the industry adopted early on. And then there's filtering. There's a couple different ISPs we use to filter the routes that they receive from their customers, depending on the complexity. Like maybe it's a really easy case. They know it's just going to be a couple ranges. They can put this into the configuration that we should only receive this type of route from the customer. But as you go up the stack in the internet hierarchy, if you're going to larger companies, it's going to be very hard for them to know what are all the possible routes that could come through another, like if you're like a tier one is accepting routes from a tier two, well, that tier two could have a lot of different customers, a lot of different types of routes. So then we need an automated process to build those filters. And so we use, we call IRR internet routing registries to build these, to store information. And so in that, we'll say there's a couple different mechanisms there, but it'll essentially try to whitelist what are the routes that would be acceptable to be received from a customer. And when you receive something that is outside that list, then reject it. Problems there is that there's like 30 of those. There's no single truth that everybody agrees upon. It can vary. Some of them have had some security issues, like the registry data itself has been a target of an attacker who had found a way to put bad information in that would enable them to announce routes they're not supposed to announce. And so the IRR area is something we use. It's widely used, but we're hoping to try to get past that and use things like RPKI ROV. So that's kind of the technology du jour right now. And let me explain a little about what that is. So RPKI is resource public key infrastructure. So this is a cryptographically secure and enforced platform that ISPs can build services, use services that are built off of RPKI to perform route filtering. And so ROV is route origin validation is a one of hopefully there'll be more is the vision, but ROV is the first one. A lot of times in this space, people say RPKI, they're really referring to RPKI ROV because that's the one application that people are actually using. So route origin validation, the way this works is that an address, or we call it a resource holder, or the person who owns the address space, would typically they do this through their RIR. So I'm using a lot of acronyms here, but if you are in North America, your RIR is Aaron, and you would log into the Aaron portal. You would have the account login if you are the owner of the address range, and through there you can build a ROA, another acronym, a route origin authorization to say what is the AS that is allowed to originate this address range. And then there's an expiration date, a max prefix length. There's a few other details there, but mostly this is what's the correct origin. Now that information then gets published out to the internet, and every entity in the world that is rejecting RPKI invalid routes will then use that information to determine when they receive a route. They would check the AS path and look at the rightmost AS in the AS path. That would be considered the origin, and see if that matches the origin listed in the ROA, the route origin authorization that's stored in RPKI. So hopefully you can follow all that. But the benefits there are it's just all the information is cryptographically enforced. You can't force some bad information in the path here. It is one ground truth for the world, so we don't have that doubt or uncertainty of which document are we going off of. This was discussed for many years, and there's advocates and debate around this, and eventually it finally took hold about 4 years ago or so. We started seeing adoption, and for a while, the issue was trying to deploy globally a security mechanism on the internet is a really hard thing, right? There's no money in it for anybody. Everyone doing this is trying to do this for the benefit of the rest of the internet. So to get people to do it, there's two steps that a network has to perform in order to have deployed RPKI ROV. So they would create ROAs for their address space to essentially communicate to the world what's the correct origin. And then they also need to reject RPKI invalid routes that are coming through their network. But for a while, we had a bit of a chicken or the egg where why would anybody bother creating ROAs? Because no one's rejecting invalids. And why would anybody reject invalids? Because no one's creating ROAs. Well, we've somehow managed to get ourselves past that chicken or the egg phase. And probably the biggest facilitator was when we had tier ones back in the year 2020 start rejecting invalids. And I'm talking about, used to be called Telia, now it's Aurelion, Lumen, Cogent, GTT, like these really big global, the top of the internet telecoms. They have huge downstream customer cones and cast a wide shadow. And so when they do something, it has broad effect. So when in that year around, it was about a year that those networks started rejecting invalids, and that really started the ball rolling, in my opinion. And we can see that if you track these things through time, you can see there's an inflection point around that time where people start creating ROAs because they feel like someone's going to actually do something about this. And on up to just in May this year, we crossed the arbitrary milestone of getting past 50% of the routes in the global IPv4 table now have ROAs and are essentially eligible for the protection that would RPKI ROV would offer. IPv6 reached that milestone last year, probably due to the fact that it has less legacy stuff to deal with. But anyway, so we look at this as success and getting ourselves on the right path. However, I want to be careful. I think people who are work with on this topic try to choose our words carefully, not to overstate what RPKI ROV is going to do for anyone, because it can be defeated. What it's most successful at is suppressing routes that are due to misoriginations. So someone has incorrectly, whether deliberately or not, originated address space they're not supposed to, then essentially the system will just suppress those routes and it'll reject those invalids. Like I said, it isn't foolproof, and we're going to need more mechanisms to try to go up the spectrum and push the needle on up to the determined adversary to try to secure that side. But we had to start somewhere in this space, and it's, as you can imagine, the internet's a big place. There's a lot of different companies and people working here. So to pull off a voluntary adoption of a global technology is a non-trivial thing. So I'll stop there, see if you have any questions.
So one of the biggest things, I think, if anybody knows anything about problems with BGP, the things that make the news are like when countries make a mistake and accidentally transfer 75% of the internet's traffic through Pakistan or through China, or accidentally knock YouTube offline for 25 minutes due to routes that become completely invalid and are transmitted out to the entire world. So these are not necessarily adversarial attacks, right? But these are people that have rights to publish global tables, right? Does any of the stuff that you've talked about interact there in any way to help or mitigate with problems that could be propagated worldwide from what would be considered a valid tier one endpoint?
Yeah, so you brought up the Pakistan YouTube incident, which is probably maybe one of the more famous BGP incidents that have ever occurred. It's worth reflecting. This is probably worth a topic on a blog post of like, if the same thing were to happen today, how would that be different? Because that's really not possible what took place. So just the backstory here was this occurred, I believe, 2008, where there was a video on YouTube that was deemed anti-Islamic, and so the government of Pakistan gave an order that they needed to block YouTube, and so this came down to PTCL, the state telecom of Pakistan. They decided they would do this via BGP, and so they would just attract all of the BGP. They create a route of YouTube address space, try to attract all the traffic that was going to YouTube, and put it in the bit bucket when it comes. So that part, it was intentional. What wasn't intentional was that they announced this accidentally out to one of their international transit providers who carried it out to the global internet. And so then, because it was a more specific, like a BGP prefers more specific, longer prefix length routes, became very popular. And about 2/3 of the internet for, I don't know, a couple of hours was believing that they need to go to PTCL in Pakistan for YouTube. That made YouTube unreachable. Pakistan also wasn't doing great either. They're not used to getting that kind of traffic. Yeah, so ultimately that was resolved. I think Google had recently purchased YouTube. They intervened, got the international carrier to stop carrying the route. But if we looked at that case again today, I call these accidental but also intentional, or intentional but also accidental, because we had this happen recently. There was a couple of cases that are worth thinking about. where a similar case in Myanmar in, let's see, trying to get my dates right. I guess it was spring of 2021. There was a military coup in Myanmar, and there was a lot of government involvement in suppressing communications. So either it was like a total shutdown, there were mobile, like nightly shutdowns, there was all kinds of different things. Everything we'd ever seen in the digital rights space was happening over a couple of months. They even had their own Pakistan YouTube incident where they had given an order out to the ISPs to block social media. One of the ISPs in Myanmar decided they would do essentially what PTCL had done in 2008, and they would take Twitter address space. They would basically announce it locally, it was, I think, their plan, and just drop that traffic when it comes to announce this out to the internet. And then so around South Asia, there was a Twitter outage where all this traffic was getting directed to Myanmar. And then fast forward 1 year later, almost a year to the day of that incident, the exact same thing happened to the same address range, same prefix, everything. And that this time it was out of Russia. So Russia had invaded Ukraine. There was a backlash, and within Russia, they started cracking down on independent media and social media. And we had the same thing. An ISP created a BGP route to block Twitter, accidentally announced it out to transit provider. But the difference was that between the spring of 2021 and spring of 2022, Twitter, now X, had created ROAs for all their address space. So this route now had a ROA, and routers all over the world would know when they see the one coming from Russia, this isn't the right one, and they would reject it. Now, that doesn't help the people in Russia, but at least contains the disruption to that area, and we're not going to be able to intervene beyond that. Anyway, so that's a good story of that growth. So if PTCL today were to announce those YouTube routes, they would probably go nowhere, and they would probably affect no one. The other thing is that YouTube isn't pulled across transit providers anymore. It's served through embedded caches in your ISPs in nearly every country in the world. There's really very few exceptions to that. So even if the RPKI wasn't there and the route got out, I don't know that it would even mess that much. It would be worthy of debate of how much impact it would really have. It certainly would be significantly less than what occurred in 2008, just to the how the internet has evolved and how content is delivered. But within the routing space, it also kind of can't happen, or at least it'll be limited. I wouldn't say there's zero impact, but RPKI ROV, yeah, like I said, it's good in those cases. This is where it's strong. And then, in recent years, where we've seen a lot of activity in the determined adversary category is against cryptocurrency services. So these are great targets for hackers, because if you can crack one of these places and steal the money, you can have it immediately and launder it, and you're gone, and there's no recourse. So it make for good targets, and so we've seen some sophisticated attacks that involve BGP hijacks, including one that did a hijack against Amazon. So this is not a mom and pop shop. This is one of the most well-resourced networks in the world that did all these things. It defeated RPKI ROV by forging the AS path so that it would be seen as valid. So the bad route would get circulated. It created a fake entry into AltDB, one of the IRRs that are used for automated creation of filters. And so there was a lot of lessons learned there, but some of these cryptocurrency attacks, I wrote up a piece, maybe we can put it in the notes for the episode, just looking at, like, this is where people in our space are trying to spend more time thinking. And so that's progress, where we're less worried about these fat finger cases, kind of covered as far as best as we can get them. And now we need to focus on determined adversary scenario.
So I read through that article that you're talking about, and I found that one example you gave of the cryptocurrency and the way that they had used all the infrastructure you would expect to sort of spoof where the routes were coming from and then make it all look legitimate. So traffic would go there and be none the wiser. And then they would just, steal your Bitcoins or whatever and abscond with them. Are there some new standards or things coming down the pike to also protect against that sort of scenario?
Yeah, so there's always more. The next thing is being pushed or advocated for is something called ASPA. So that doesn't deal with the cryptocurrency attack scenario, but autonomous system provider authorization. So the way this works is each network, which is an autonomous system, is going to, within the system, assert what are its transit providers. And in the same way that we create a ROA, and this will be information that's stored within the RPKI platform and cryptographically delivered everywhere. So then by asserting what are your transit providers, this enables other networks to look at an AS path and detect what we call a valley-free violation. And so maybe I'll explain a little bit what that is. So in BGP, I don't know if you got into this in your last episode, but there is hierarchy to the whole thing. So it's not, I think maybe in a textbook, it might look like it's a little amorphous. Everybody just kind of connects to everybody else, but there is a hierarchy to it. So for the most part, you have networks that are buying transit from other networks. So you get to the top, there's a default free zone or transit free zone of the top of the internet. There's a kind of cabal there of a dozen or more ISPs that don't buy service from anybody. They just sell and then they connect to each other. And so as traffic goes across the internet, it's either crossing these transit edges or the alternative is a peering relationship. And these are the two classic types of relationships. What you can't do is your traffic is always going to go over a hill. So you're going to be going up the transit links until you get to a top and then comes down the other side to the destination. Or maybe you've got a way to cut through it with a peering relationship, but you can't go down, because if you go down, when we draw this on diagrams, we say, transit is up, is how we draw it. And it's the mental model. May not translate in the podcast very well. But so then if you're going down, basically you're drawing a line, you're going from a provider to a customer back up to a provider, then that customer is paying both sides to send that traffic. It's all about money. It's as much about technical stuff as it is around business. And so when you and I have internet connections at our house or phone, for the most part, they're kind of all you can eat. You pay some sort of flat fee, and unless you do something crazy, or you're hosting whatever stuff, you don't worry about how much you're using. But in the wholesale market, it's by bits, so by volume, that you pay by volume. And so then they're trying to either the providers are trying to either reduce costs or increase revenue. And one way they reduce costs is by peering, so they don't get around other transit providers. But if you're going from a provider to a customer back up to a provider, then that customer is paying both legs and is receiving no money. So that's something you would never want to have happen. And people go to great lengths to try to avoid that, because you're basically paying twice for something you're not getting paid for. So that's a valley in this valley-free terminology. And so that does happen, but it's usually a leak, like a mistake. So the AS has taken a route from one side and sent it to another by mistake.
We covered that a little bit in the last episode because I talked about what happened with the Allegheny provider, where it was using Verizon and DQE or something were the two providers that it was using. And it had accidentally leaked routes from Verizon out through DQE, telling everybody, send your traffic through me, basically. And so that would have been a big valley.
Yeah, it's a great example of a valley. So in that case, yeah, Allegheny is a customer of both Verizon and DQE. The routes went from DQE to Allegheny to Verizon. The vision is that could be picked up and just blocked immediately. Had Allegheny asserted in RPKI using ASPA, who are its transit providers, people would look at that and be like, okay, somebody made a mistake. I won't carry this. That incident has a few lessons learned. Obviously, Cloudflare made a lot of big stink about it because they got affected, rightly so. And it did prompt a discussion around RPKI ROV. But what's interesting to me is that RPKI ROV would have helped in that case, but not because of the origin being changed. The origins for the routes that were leaked were actually intact. So like Cloudflare's 13335. As somebody who works with this stuff, I have like thousands of these ASNs memorized. So the AS origin, the rightmost AS, and any of those route leaked paths, it was correct. So by checking the origin, it wouldn't have filtered the routes. But because the Blue's DQE was using a route optimizer, which locally creates these more specific routes to try to do traffic engineering, those more specific routes then were what really attracted the traffic. But they also would have been RPKI invalid because the routes of Cloudflare, and I think Akamai was in this as well, they had ROAs that set a maximum prefix length. So for a prefix, what we call a prefix is a BGP route as an address range, and the address range has got a network portion and a host portion, and then the prefix length then sets what's the network portion. And then in our parlance and routing, we just talk about prefixes. But in that case, those prefixes would have been invalid due to the max prefix length setting in the ROAs. So I also bring that case up because that's probably the last really big debilitating routing leak that's occurred. And so that was, I think, 2019. We're a little more than 5 years out, which when I give talks, I was like, there's not an accident that was the last. I mean, we may have another one. I mean, while we're speaking right now, it could be something disastrous could be happening, but we've gone a long time. 5 years is a long time in internet time. And so things have gotten better due to a lot of these things. The filtering we talked about, max prefix length, ASPA really is just getting started. So I don't think we're going to see benefit from it for a little while. But RPKI ROV is helping. Yeah, there's just a variety of different. We call it routing hygiene. Just all these different things that providers do. And there's a lot of best practices, and Manners is a organization that's mutually agreed norms for routing security. It's kind of the industry's advocacy group for enumerating what are the things that networks need to steps they should take to improve routing security, routing hygiene, and they've been very instrumental in being the go-to and being good advocates for routing security.
So manners is sort of like an opt-in, right? You want to be a good citizen, you want to have good manners.
That's correct. Yeah.
I know recently the FCC has been trying to push being a little more stick and less the carrot when it comes to BGP security. So, what is the FCC trying to do, and how is the industry responding to what they've been pushing?
Yeah. So back in 2022, the FCC, this is a Federal Communications Commission, a U.S. agency overseeing our telecommunications sector in the United States, decided to get involved or figure out what leadership does it need to provide in routing security. Obviously, this is something that affects the United States, and there's a national security element to this as well. They began a process where they were seeking inquiry, asking industry experts to ask them what they think they should be doing. And there've been a bunch of events that they've held and documents they've published. And then this year, within the last couple of months, they published they're seeking comment. They're really trying to get illicit feedback from the industry, and they're getting some of like what should be the rules they require of U.S. telecoms. And so what they did was identify a list of 9 telecoms. They call them BIAS. Oh, was another acronym. It's not an acronym I'd seen before, but there's always a new one. That these 9 telecoms need to deploy RPKI ROV. So there's 2 things that they need to do. That they need to create ROAs, and there's a way we can all measure and see that they provide these. So BIAS stands for Broadband Internet Access Service, and the companies are AT&T, Altus, which owns Suddenlink, Cablevision, Charter, which is also Spectrum, Comcast, Cox, Lumen, which I don't know if everybody knows, is both a regional broadband provider and then also plays this role in the global internet. T-Mobile, our mobile operator, TDS, which now owns or is in the process of owning US Cellular, Verizon. Anyway, those are the 9. That each of these companies needs to create ROAs for their address space, at least 90% of the routes that they originate, and also reject invalids. And so they're seeking comment on this. And so what I decided I would look at was, all right, well, now that they name these companies, let's see how they fare today. And I just ran through the numbers, at least on the ROA creation side. It's very tricky for us to remotely figure out to what extent, if at all, they're rejecting invalids. Different people have come up with different methodologies. It's still a kind of open research area. But 5 out of the 9 would do very well right now, or they're probably already at 90% of the routes. And I work at a company that deals in large amounts of net flow. So we work in the service provider space. So these are companies that we would work with. And so we have a lot of net flow that gets shared to us as part of the service that we provide. And so we have a nice slice of the internet of just the traffic that's going across it for analysis and study. This is what I spent a lot of my time doing. And so I looked at the traffic that we see going to these large US telecoms and how much of it was going to routes with ROAs. And for a few of them, like T-Mobile and Cox and Comcast, Charter Spectrum, it's nearly universal. Almost every packet going to those networks are going to routes with ROAs, meaning that they're eligible for protection. That's one side of the internet transaction. That's the traffic coming back to the user. The other side is not really covered in this proposal, which would be what are they going to? What are they sending their traffic? Or where are they requesting data from? Which could be a bank or cryptocurrency service that's under attack, or that side of it. They're not getting into, although I suspect that may not be where they focus their time. They're looking at what are the rules that the U.S. telecoms need to follow. Yeah, so I went through this, and yeah, it's generating a little bit of discussion here in our community of just, for one, whenever you do something like this, you can't get it all right. I try to be explicit about what ASs I was using for the analysis. I'm getting some feedback. I missed a couple. I'm happy to update it, but some of these companies use dozens, or AT&T has over 100 ASs that they use. So I'm trying to manage the complexity of that and still provide some analysis. But in this proposal, the Internet Society, which was the former home of Manners, which you talked about earlier, which since has moved to the Global Cyber Alliance, those two entities wrote up a joint ex parte response to the proposal by the FCC, pushing back pretty strenuously against a federal requirement that telecoms adopt RPKI ROV. And the points they made were that it's dangerous in security to legislate you have to use this particular solution because now everybody has to do that thing, and maybe it becomes obsolete, or things have changed and now it's counterproductive and you're stuck complying with this rule. There's a concern there of just ossifying some kind of a requirement. And then also, I guess smaller providers were kind of excluded from this first pass. They made the argument that small providers, this would be a cumbersome or burdensome thing to comply with. But the first point they made was using the analysis that myself and this other expert in the space, that we've kind of collaborated quite a bit on this topic. This guy Job Snyder's, who's at Fastly now, is probably the leading voice in routing security, has been for a while. In fact, a lot of the progress that we've made is directly attributable to his work. So he and I worked together quite a bit on this, and both the FCC rules and the ex parte response, pushing back on them, both relied on our analysis that showed that we have a lot of ROAs that have been created. In fact, those ROAs represent the majority. Now it's a supermajority of the traffic that's exchanged on the internet is going to routes with ROAs, and then conversely, routes that are deemed invalid just don't get propagated as much. In fact, they're suppressed quite a bit. So the system is working as designed, and we've reached a point of adoption where the next network to do these things, to create ROAs for their address space, to start rejecting invalids, would have immediate benefit because there's been so much adoption thus far. That work was highlighted in both the FCC document as well as the pushback. Yeah, their point was, look, the industry has already made a lot of progress, and there was no government mandate. I mean, it's a pretty good argument, because all this progress I'm describing, there's no government mandate. It's just simply advocacy work within the communities around the world, and getting it to a point where there's some peer pressure, if not shame, to motivate networks that aren't doing the stuff to do it. And if things change and there's a better solution and this needs to be abandoned, then so be it. But right now, it didn't require any government intervention. And so that's part of their argument. I think there's a lot of people who, certainly in the industry, that would be their take. We've actually done a pretty good job without any government rules. And folks in our space, even if we are sympathetic to the issues that are being brought up by the FCC, are a little leery about codifying something and how hard would that be to change, and what are the unintended consequences of that. I think people worry and wring their hands a little, rightly so. But anyway, that's the kind of the latest in that, and we'll see where this goes. I think there's a few more days as of the recording. Recording this on the July 12th. I think you can submit. This will probably be published after this deadline, but on July 17th, I think, is the deadline for submitting your pushback. I'm sure people are writing their opinions.
Yeah, we'll be one day after that for publish. So you
well,
just missed it, everybody.
Too bad.
But yeah, no, I echo your concerns, because I know anything that goes into a government regulation tends to ossify. And so now you're stuck with if it's written in such a way that it's a very specific technology, you're just stuck with that until the lawmakers get around to updating it. We covered a story in our lightning round this week all around how Japan has finally gotten rid of using floppy disks in the government agencies. And the reason they were using floppies is not because people wanted to. It's because there were very specific regulations on the books that required them to use floppy disks of a specific type and size. And so they were like, well, that's what we have to do.
Wow. Yeah. So then we have an added complication to that whole discussion, is the Supreme Court decision that overturned Chevron deference. So
Right.
I am not a lawyer. I don't know about you guys. So I have
Not
a
at
very
all.
layman's understanding of this, but essentially it would curtail what a regulatory body can do on its own without this being explicitly laid out in legislation from Congress. And that means it's not clear to me, again, as a layperson, can they make these rules now? Is this considered under something that's presently in legislation? Because if it's going to require Congress to be involved, then all bets are off, I think. We're
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
better off just letting the industry try to take care of itself. But anyway, directionally, I appreciate their concern. This is an area that is worth trying to improve. But yeah, we just have to be careful not to create something counterproductive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Doug, we're coming up on time. Before we say goodbye, where can people find you on the internet if they want to know more? And can you tell us a little bit about what Kentik does as well as your employer?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Kentik is a network observability company. And so we are best known by the NetFlow analytics products we've been building for 8 years. And we grew up out of the service provider industry, but we now have, I think, the majority of our customers are what we call enterprise. So these are just people who aren't telecoms or ISPs. That's who we're spending a lot of our time with. So there's the NetFlow thing. We help companies with understand how they're exchanging traffic with their cloud deployments. That seems to be a pretty big topic for us these days. We see a lot of demand there. We do synthetics, which is basically performance monitoring, and BGP. So BGP is kind of my area, and so we have a BGP monitoring and analysis capabilities. But yeah, it's a cool company. And then as far as reaching out to me, I'm on Twitter X. I'm on LinkedIn. That's usually the best places to reach me. Otherwise, maybe we could add a little link to, I write blog posts for the Kentik blog. That's usually where I'm publishing stuff out to the world.
Awesome. Well, we'll include links to all those kinds of things in the show notes. Doug Madory, thank you so much for being a guest with us on Chaos Lever. And hey, dear listener, thanks for tuning in. I guess you found it worthwhile enough if you made it all the way to the end. So, congratulations to you, friend. You accomplished something today. Now you can go sit on the couch, fire up some ROAs, and implement RPKI. You have earned it. You can find more about the show by visiting our LinkedIn page. Just search Chaos Lever, or you can go to our website, chaoslever.com, where you'll find show notes, blog posts, and general tomfoolery. We'll be back next week to see what fresh hell is upon us. Ta ta for now.